If you want to support the channel, then please check out my Patreon page to gain access to exclusive videos, take part in Q&As, and watch my retrospectives before they go live on YouTube. Hello everyone, it's Oliver Harper here. For this discussion on the James Bond movies of the 1980s, I'm joined by 007 experts Ajay Chowdhury, the co-author of the book Some Kind of Hero, an 800-page biography of the Bond films, and Mark O'Connell, the writer of Catching Bullets, Memoirs of a Bond Fan. We explore how these movies were made, how audiences reacted to them at the time, how Bond stayed relevant during this decade, and how the action sequences are still influencing filmmakers today. So obviously with Moonraker, finishing off the Bond adventures of the 1970s, we saw 007 go into space, and as the producers wanted to sort of capture the craze of what was going on with Star Wars, but for many, the film was kind of more inspired by 2001: A Space Odyssey, kind of outside of the sort of laser gun battle. John Glenn now getting a promotion to the director's chair. He and the producers sort of agreed to take Bond back to Earth and return him to his more traditional roots. So with For Your Eyes Only, released in 1981, there was talk of this being the last outing of Roger Moore as 007 due to his age, but also he was convinced to come back. So kickstarting the 80s, do you guys think this film makes an effort, I suppose, to offer something new and reflect on what was happening at the time, or was it sort of more like, let's go back to what people want before things got a little bit too crazy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good introduction of it. I think let's just take a big step back and see where Bond was. You've said Moonraker, but the Bond films in the 70s, written by Tom Mankiewicz and Lewis Gilbert directed, with these big technological extravaganzas, the budgets had gone up from about 7 million in Diamonds Are Forever in 71 to 33 million in Moonraker. Huge increase in budgets. And Moonraker was shot in Paris because of tax reasons in the UK. And the whole way of making Bond films had United Artists were hugely successful studio. They were the Disney of their day. They had Rocky, they had the Pink Panther, they had artistic movies, they were winning Oscars. And after Moonraker, the whole idea was to basically reset the schedule for budgetary reasons and artistic reasons. They felt they couldn't go forward. So Cubby Broccoli promotes from within. He hires the editor of the last two films, John Glenn, who was also a seasoned action director in the Ewan Lloyd movies, those action movies of the 70s. He brings on his stepson, Michael G. Wilson, who had wanted to direct Bond films. In fact, allegedly directed the Anaconda sequence in Moonraker, but found his home as a writer. He's an engineer and a lawyer prior to that, and then brings on board his writing and technological skills. And Cubby Broccoli then goes back to Richard Maybaum, the erstwhile writer of the classic 60s Bond films. He was sort of got lost in the mix in the 70s. And with this group, John Glenn, Michael Wilson, and Richard Maybaum, and then Peter Lamont replaces Ken Adam. He's been Ken Adam's art director. And they go for a much more realistic, grounded reality, where they think character and the spirit and essence of the action of Fleming and the humanity can take place. And For Your Eyes Only tries to reach back in there. And also you then get John Glenn's action eyes. John Glenn had done second unit on Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, and also on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And then you get the new team specializing in actions. You've got aero units dominated by BJ Worth, the parachutist in Moonraker, Corky Thornoff, the stunt pilot in Octopussy and License to Kill, and Willie Bogner Jr., who did great ski stunts throughout the 80s Bond films. So the 80s Bond films try to innovate in their action and bring something new that we'd not seen before, real camera, in terms, in real locations. And this is their way of adding value to it and getting ahead of the game. So they were actually going back in some ways to their action movie roots, escaping the special effects driven, and also trying to bring back zeitgeistian cultural plot points. So For Your Eyes Only is very much set in the real world. It's the only Bond film actually in the whole series where the villains are the Soviets. And even there, they have a kindly face of Gogol. All the others co-opted the Soviet threat in terms of a renegade spy or renegade general. We see this throughout the 80s played out. It's détente, it's the Cold War. We've got the resurgence of kind of right-wing politics with Reagan and Thatcher. Hence, you get Thatcher, who was at her time a cultural revolution to an extent, whether you agreed with their politics or not. Just the mere fact we had this iconic female leading the country. Hence, she gets a role in For Your Eyes Only. And you get a plot set in the Cold War where spy ships were a thing. They were all over the North Atlantic, and For Your Eyes Only is informed by that. But then you also go back to the Ian Fleming short stories. For the first time, for a long time, you get an adaptation of 1960 short story collection, For Your Eyes Only, which is Melina, Havelock, Judy in the books. And the whole point of that short story is her parents are friends of M. And when M assigns Bond to kill the assassins, Von Hammerstone and Gonzalez, M feels he's using Bond on a personal mission. And Bond sort of assures them, no, these people deserve to be killed. In fact, they're in the book, they're holdovers from the Batista regime, who was the criminal gangster in charge of Cuba before Castro came in. And that's a nice point. And then you get an adaptation of the drug smuggling subplot in Risico, which in the short story is set in Italy. And here it's transferred seamlessly to Greece. And then you get the sort of ATAC device, automatic targeting attack communicator, which can fire nuclear missiles. And that's the kind of MacGuffin, that's the Lector of today. And they talked, Michael Wilson, Covey Book, he talked about going back to From Russia with Love type of Cold War spy thriller. And For Your Eyes Only was that attempt to do that. It really wasn't trying to be anything else at the time. It was very much trying to be a Bond film, if you like, again, trying to recapture the spirit and essence.
Do you think that at the time there may be a sort of reflection that, from the fans in particular, that Bond was getting a little bit too kind of out of control, that some of the fans kind of wanted this kind of return to From Russia with Love kind of vibes? And I mean, some of my friends have said For Your Eyes Only is kind of like, you know, the one sort of serious outing for Roger Moore, because I suppose he always kind of symbolised one little moment in his performance where he kicks the car off the cliff, which shows you a darker side to his Bond, which he kind of didn't want to do, I don't think. I think it was a bit unnarring about that. I mean, Mark, did you think there was a kind of a interesting sort of change for Roger's kind of character of Bond, and obviously with the sort of refresh of the crew, do you think that was kind of the right move, considering this is going to be the kickstart in the 80s to sort of give the films a sort of new boost, I suppose?
Yeah, yes and no. I feel so we have Moonraker. That's kind of like the starter to the 80s, and I always think that, like AJ's suggested, Moonraker is not the Broccoli's trying to cash in on Star Wars. Moonraker is the Broccoli's trying to cash in on big cinema that the kids were going to. So then when we have, I mean, I think AJ said it before, and I've said it before. Moonraker is more 2001. So what did Kubrick follow up 2001 with? Well, he followed it up with Clockwork Orange. Still a big concept film, but, you know, set in more or less filmed and shot in Britain and the home counties, and a lot more of a smaller film. And I think you could make sort of loose allusions there. There was also studio stuff and ownership stuff creeping up. MGM UA had a massive hit. Took a hit rather, with the whole Heaven's Gate saga. Although if you look at, I've been doing the last year or so, really doing a deep dive into the MGM Bond timeline history, it is manifold, it is deeply complex. But around that 79-80 time, because obviously
it's United Artists.
United Artists, they took the big hit with Heaven's Gate, but then Heaven's Gate was a flop in 80. For Your Eyes Only was already, you know, in the starting blocks, but I presume there would have been a little bit of hesitance to go big again. And also, you know, narratively, once you've gone to space shuttles and the stars, you know, figuratively and literally, what do you do? So you do pare it back. I always think For Your Eyes Only I really like For Your Eyes Only. I think it's a real slightly tight novella of a Bond film, ironically based on a novella of a Bond short story. I mean, it's like when everyone says, oh, it's like, you know, License to Kill went smaller or other films went smaller. I've yet to see a Bond film go smaller. You know, Dr. No is not actually a small Bond film. Neither is From Russia with Love. So yes, they pared it down, but 83 Octopussy was the first Bond film I was aware of its release. am. I just about remember the sort of, the Union Jack, the Britishness, and the mentions of For Your Eyes Only. I remember it being sometimes you see the posters in old cinemas still be there, that great defining Bond poster image of the legs and the crossbow, or depending which version you saw of it. But I do like For Your Eyes Only. Yes, I think it's. I mean, it's the beginning of a new era. It's the first. From that point on until Roger leaves the role, there's three Bond films where Bond is kind of. We always hear this, Roger Moore was too old for his leading ladies, and he would say that, but no one says that about Harrison Ford doing recent things he's done in the last 10, 20 years. No one says it about Keanu Reeves right now, who's about the same age doing Matrix, Reloaded, Resurrections again, whatever it's called. He was the same age as Roger Moore, and he's allowed.
Well, do you think that, obviously, because in For Your Eyes Only, he gets the affection of a very younger girl. Obviously, because considering their age gap, obviously Bond is kind of like doesn't want to get involved, but it was still this kind of, they're playing on the idea that he was still this kind of leading handsome man that the girls would still chase after.
Yeah, I mean, he keeps Lynn Holly Johnson at definite legal bay. Even then, it's kind of like, thank God, Sir Roger kept her at bay, and it's playful, and it touches upon what I think he does in his final three Bond films that happen to be his 80s Bond films. He's almost now okay. I don't know if many godfathers will take showers and sleep with their nieces or godnieces or whatever it is. But I feel he's almost become the slightly older uncle, the gatekeeper to the family jewels. I mean that in the not in the euphemism way. That there's a little bit of sort of godfather authority, and he's being a minder to these people. And then you've got three women rather, whose stories are all about their daddy issues. Melina Havelock, and then Octopussy, and then Stacey Sutton and A View to a Kill.
I think with the score as well by Bill Conti, which is kind of, I think a perfect reflection of what was kind of going on with music as well.
Well, it was perfect reflection that Rocky was a major franchise. It won, the Rocky theme charted. I think so did a lot of the score from Rocky 2, which was 78, 79. And also Bill Conti did, and we'll get onto that, maybe we'll go into View to a Kill, but Bill Conti did the theme to Dynasty. It's Dynasty now, it's not Dynasty.
Oliver, I think that you make a good point about, did it provide, in context at the time, fans loved the return to what they saw as Bond. Now, in context of what we've come through, remember, this was quote unquote meant to be a serious Bond film, relative to what had come before it was. But of course, now we see it in the rearview mirror, and it sort of still feels quite jokey and fun. But Roger Moore, of course, had qualms about playing a harder Bond, but he'd played it much harder in Man with the Golden Gun and Live and Let Die. But that was part of the kind of directorial discussion. And I think, to be fair to Roger Moore, at 51 in those days, that was still what a leading man was. He was still getting away with women throwing themselves at him, and he was still a cover star on all the female magazines, and he was still sort of the avuncular older matinee idol. He wasn't the first flush of youth, but a lot of stars at that time weren't. And remember, there weren't really any other contemporary action heroes of his ilk, certainly not in the UK. The UK wasn't making popular franchise movies generally. Bond was the only game in town. And again, also how these movies were sold. We talked about the posters, or we're not saying that, say, Star Wars with Moonraker, they used those tropes as marketing. It wasn't the concept of the film. So for Your Eyes Only, it was very much a kind of going back to that old adventure. They were going retro. You see all sorts of things. Remember, For Your Eyes Only wasn't supposed to have Roger Moore in. He'd said he wasn't going to do it in the summer of 1980. And it was built, all that continuity, Universal Exports, the mention of Tracy and her grave, the throwing of the hat, Moneypenny, all of that was supposed to usher in a new James Bond. And that was where people like Timothy Dalton had been talked about, and other actors that had discussions. But eventually Roger Moore came back, he got his money, and that was the thing. But they kept all those elements in. So it was really going back to go forward. And it wasn't quite a legacy Bond, but it was very much built to be part of the continuous series.
Well, that's what I liked about the opening of For Your Eyes Only, is that sort of, where he goes back to the grave of his, his wife. I like that at that point they're still trying to connect the dots with his past, and because it was always with Bond, even throughout the 80s and even into the Pierce Brosnan era, there wasn't much. Nothing was ever dwelled on his past. So
yeah, they didn't. Well, also they were written differently in those days. They weren't thinking of character arcs per se. And again, talking about the zeitgeist, apart from the extreme sports and those things that were fashionable, from Roger Moore's skiing outfits and all those things, those were what people were into. The Olympics was a huge thing in 1980, especially the Winter Olympics, and all these things feature in the movie. And then with the music, but John Barry couldn't do it because for tax reasons. So he himself suggested Bill Conti, who had worked on the United Artists franchise Rocky, and he came in and gave it that really 80s sound. And of course, the Billie Eilish of her day, Sheena Easton, singing. The score was nominated for an Oscar. In fact, in 1982, they do a big Bond special at the Oscars celebrating all of that.
Which needs to be seen. That it's on YouTube. It needs to be seen. And Harold Sakata, is it Harold Sakata? He crops up at one point as well. It's nuts. And it slightly reminds of that Ralph McQuarrie concept art that one of the big theme parks, they were going to do this big sort of Universal Tour style Bond attraction, but it didn't quite happen. But that's as near as it got.
We see that throughout the 80s Bond films, even now, that they're using the marketing, they're using all the selling aspects to rejuvenate Bond. So you've got, and For Your Eyes Only was a big hit song, and it reushered the film. Just to go on a little bit about the budget, in 1980, you'd had a worldwide recession. So Moonraker cost $33 million. This film cost approximately $28 million in dollars, but in real terms, it was much less because of inflation absorbed that movie. So they were mindful of making that budget go a lot further. And when United Artists basically sold itself to MGM, you had a whole new broom which takes over in Octopussy. It doesn't really affect For Your Eyes Only. Rather like now, the MGM sale to Amazon, we don't really know the repercussions of it. We didn't really know the repercussions of For Your Eyes Only of the sale then, and that was rolled out. And also the other thing about a Bond film and the landscape, and this compares with other action movies, is Bond films are almost unique in their size and scope of international best-selling movies. From premieres and press junkets and all that marketing hype was not done internationally for movies. Later on, when we get to the action movies, which are supposed to have influenced Bond, we see they're huge hits in North America, but Bond outgrosses them all around the world. So Bond is still very international vehicles, from the casting of this movie, Topol and Julian Glover, and they were going for that international, again, well-known actors, but not stars. They were recruiting from within. Julian Glover himself had auditioned to play James Bond in the early 70s. So what we're getting in For Your Eyes Only is going back to go forward, recruiting from within, getting new blood, a huge risk. It probably would never be done before today when you get an editor of an own movie making a brand new movie. And that's what For Your Eyes Only exemplifies. And yes, it's difficult to see the zeitgeist now because it's very much in that 80s prism, but it was as contemporary and as on the point for all those points we've mentioned as we could have imagined at that time. And the critics liked it. Which other Bond film has the reigning prime minister a cameo at the end?
It's nuts, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy.
It's super cheesy.
And even London with Beckton Gasworks and the pre-time thing, it's all kind of a little bit recession bomb, but it works because it's exciting. And also now, having seen it through the sophisticated prism of post No Time to Die, you won't get Blofelds and helicopters and all that fun and excitement and real locations and real action on screen. Derek Meddings doing special effects, great of Superman, but all that team that were born and sort of raised, as Mark says, Chris Cobble, the Lamont family, John Richardson took over later from Derek Meddings. Then they all fuel and make the action movies, Star Wars and the Harry Potters, the heads of department are all people who flourished and were emerged from the Bond era of the 80s, which had this consistent production run, headed, of course, by John Glenn and his view of practical effects done well in camera. That also say, again, the Bond films were resistant to Hollywood movies because they didn't have elaborate optical effects or post-production. They were very much, you shot it, and there was a little bit of that, and we'll come back to later, but they still were very much insistent on doing it there and then at the time for cost reasons, time reasons, and also aesthetic reasons.
Can I just add the one production element, one creative element that perhaps For Your Eyes Only marks in the beginning of Bond's 80s decade mark, is that it became the era that you can actually trace back the lineage, the creative DNA of No Time to Die and where Bond is right now.
Absolutely.
Back to the early 80s. It was the first film that Debbie McWilliams was the casting director for. And she's 40 plus years later, she's still doing it. I believe it's her daughter Jemima. She's helping and she's rising up the ranks, and they're sharing screen credit on No Time to Die. You've got Chris Cobbold. Yes, he may have been an uncredited 16-year-old on For Your Eyes Only. Again, they all just did summer jobs and would just rock up, and I love that. It's a very different industry now. But Cobbold started in that era. You've got Peter Lamont, who, whilst he didn't sadly do No Time to Die because he passed and that wasn't his gig, but he finally gets given the keys to the production department. And also don't overlook Barbara Broccoli. She may have started in the press department as a 17-year-old on Spy Who Loved Me in 76, 77. But by the time of 81, and particularly 83, Barbara, I think 83 and Octopussy might be the first time she gets a screen credit. And she starts to oversee some big set pieces to get a bit of experience, an experience that actually is very important, obviously, in 20, 30, and definitely 40 years' time. So yeah, the 80s, whilst a lot of fans who really, that first era of Bond movie fandom who grew up and loved and rightfully adored the Connery era and Ken Adam and John Barry, they were the generation that became a little, possibly, allegedly sniffy of the Roger Moore films, feeling that the whole thing is beginning to wind down and that the cloth is being wrung out a bit. Well, that's one take, but my take is it marked the seedlings of a new era that, as I say, can be traced back to where we are now, and also where we will be, when we get the 007th Bond in times to come.
But of course, it seeded the crew that still works on Bond. But also, for just a few artistic points that get missed, For Your Eyes Only kind of subverts the Bond mythos in many ways. So you have a car chase set up with the Lotus Esprit, but it blows up, and you've got the De Chauveau. You've got a sort of anticlimactic ending, which isn't the big fortress battle, but it's a kind of it's a kind of stoic political sentiment about the destruction of the ATAC. So For Your Eyes Only deliberately subverts a lot of Bond tropes, which now are artistically, we've done it before, but For Your Eyes Only was one of the first films after the era to kind of take a look at the legend of Bond and slightly tweak it a bit, so you don't get quite what you expect. And Michael Wilson talks about subverting the technology, gadgets, and a gadget-free Bond. They really sort of artistically reclaimed a ground that they could have quite happily carried on being push-button technological extravaganzas, but Eyes Only isn't given enough credit for bringing all those artistic human decisions back to Earth as well. That's all.
Well, what we saw, come 1983 with Octopussy, where Mark, you'd mentioned about some of the fans getting a bit kind of snooty with Roger Moore. Now, I suppose they would get their chance to see Sean going up against Roger Moore with Never Say Never Again, sort of competing at the box office. And also, that year, it was a big year for sequels with Superman 3 and Return of the Jedi.
And Jaws 3.
And Jaws 3.
Amityville 3. Come on, I've written lots of this. Yeah, there's a lot of threes in 83. Psycho 3. No.
Yeah, exactly. Weirdly, I saw this, I think there was a documentary a while back by the BBC, but they go back to an old kind of clip where they're doing the, I think it was the premiere of Octopussy, and the host of the show, or the news, whatever, was very negative on Roger Moore, saying Sean Connery was his Bond. And it's kind of weird seeing the BBC at the time sort of being like that, not being kind of balanced with their opinions. But
that was something Ajay and I were discussing recently about this. There's a whole 5 podcast discussion on the TV the telecast of royal premieres, because we didn't have film premieres every week. Now we get it for Romeo and Juliet 3, and it's part of the marketing, but it wasn't a given back in the 70s and 80s. So you have these big Bond TV premiere shows. And the irony is the Never Say Never Again one was on, I believe it was on BBC One, whereas you had the I don't know who it was, usually Peter Marshall and sometimes Judith Chalmers cropping up in the 80s Thames broadcast ones. And they were critical. I remember there's a great one, we're going forward a bit here, but in June 87, when Thames TV covered the premiere night live, that was it was live as well. It wasn't like just highlights, but it was live with Nick Owen and Lois Maxwell. And Lois Maxwell is, I'm sorry, she's quietly seething that she has to interview Caroline Bliss, who's now replaced her in The Living Daylights. And there's this whole thing of, I didn't like this. I didn't like that. Oh, well, getting back to that, there's a great moment. She went, Lois, I hope I have as long in the role as you do. And she went, yes, so do I. And it was like a real watch it. It's, and you can see them both really awkwardly. But yeah, they were even, sort of 3 or 4 films into Roger Moore's era, the journalists would still be going, yeah, but you're not Connery, are you? But then, taking it back to 83 and Octopussy, versus Rocky 3 versus Never Say Never Again, we suddenly look what happens. The Broccoli's, we wondered, the three of us, did Octopussy bend itself knowing that Never Say Never Again was coming? I don't think so. I think the only thing they probably bent at the beginning was to keep Roger Moore and keep that consistency.
Well, that's what I find kind of interesting with that sort of them going head to head, because Never Say Never Again was always kind of the black sheep of it all, wasn't it? Because it wasn't an official Bond film, but I do like to wind Bond fans up sometimes saying, "Oh, it's official. Sean Connery's in it," But
can I put my legal head on this about Never Say Never Again? Firstly, there are no unofficial Bond films. Never Say Never Again was completely within its legal rights and was official, but it just wasn't it was a non-Eon Bond film. And of course, Never Say Never Again was supposed to have come out as Warhead in 1979. It was going to star Orson Welles. There was all sorts of, Never Say Never Again had a long tail on that ghost. It's supposed to come out actually in the same summer as Octopussy, the Battle of the Bonds, which we'd had actually in Casino in 1967 with Casino Royale. And that's what this was supposed to be about. And as Mark says, the only effect perhaps Never Say Never Again had on Octopussy was that Roger Moore was again saying, I won't do it. Cubby Broccoli was going to cast James Brolin. Screen tests were done. He was due to fly out and do the movie when they realised if Connery's going to come back, we need Roger Moore. And that's what happens. But really, I think in effect, and being a fan at the time and remembering the fan sentiment behind Connery, actually Never Say Never Again ends up being much more drawn towards a Sean Connery Americanized Roger Moore Bond film than the other way round. But Octopussy was an interesting picture. It was the first one made under the auspices of MGM UA. They were new broom. They were looking at the finances. Bond was the key thing in their closet there, and they really wanted to make it work. But just an interesting thing about how it was financed. They shot in India, and one of the reasons they shot in India, which they'd mooted for previous films, was that the studio had lots of frozen funds there. So in order to access them, they had to make a movie there to use that money. So those are the kinds of decisions that were being made to make Octopussy in India. It still was so. For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy returned to Pinewood Studios after being away for tax reasons for Moonraker. Now we're back in England, and Octopussy is shot quite a lot in the UK. Scenes in West Germany are replicated, not only in West Germany, but also in the UK. So we're using a lot of UK filming and locations. Of course, they go to India, and in the pre-title sequence is shot in America and is trying to replicate some South American country. Many speculated at the time it was meant to be Argentina, have the Britons just having fought a war with, and the Falklands in 82. And then Octopussy was inspired by real life jewelry smuggling into Russia, the Kremlin, to raise hard currency. And of course, the Cold War plot of General Orlov was drawn straight from a real life NATO war game where the Russians could invade, and the only way the US or the NATO forces could deflect them was by using small range nuclear weapons. And that was a real life war game, which was the only thing. And Octopussy co-ops it and then uses this unilateral disarmament talk, which a lot was talked about at the time in Greenham Common. And again, this is the zeitgeist of Octopussy.
Like the whole idea of air bases, that was always that was a real 80s thing, the
US air base,
the US air bases on sort of European soil and British soil, and Never Say Never Again, and both For Your Eyes Only kind of tap into that a little.
With For Your Eyes Only, I mean, they've kind of shifted the tone a bit to be a little bit more serious, where Octopussy, it sort of plays on what worked with the Spy Love Me, I suppose, or in terms of Moonraker. It's a little bit more. I always felt it was tonally very kind of uneven film.
Yeah, you're right. I think it's fair to say that they've taken it back for Eyes Only, and they expand it. Octopussy is in some ways the most fantastical, most imaginative of the. It's sort of a Cold War thriller wrapped in some relics of the Raj type. It's Empire setting.
I mean, there was a whole genre in the early 80s. You couldn't turn on television or sort of British cinema without having some nod, whether it was Passage to India, which was a year, a year later, or Far Pavilions, Heat and Dust. There was a real Raj renaissance and a curiosity, and I don't think there is a darkness to Octopussy, and the whole last act where Bond is dressed as a clown trying to avert nuclear war. I've always likened that to something from a Kubrick movie. You've got all these kids and children sat in the circus. Incidentally, a whole sequence that was masterminded by Barbara Broccoli, and a friend of mine was one of the extras in all the circus scenes, and they all had to wear two coats. So that halfway through, they'd shoot all the opening scenes where the circus was used, or the earlier scenes, but then it had to have a different audience. So everyone had to basically change their coat and move their seat in order to make it look like it was a different crew of extras.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant.
But yeah, I've always found Octopussy is a little dark with that nuclear stuff, but it does have that timeless, it's steam trains, it's hot air balloons. I also think it's tapping into that again. Bond is, I don't want to say reactive to what's around. I think it's reflective. Like Bond is not just a big cultural mainstay. He reflects the culture that's around him. So like what, Dr. No from Rush of Love has got their Hitchcock influences, and then by the time we get to Octopussy, I think you can see that the Peter Ustinov, especially those Agatha Christie movies, that grandiose sense, the idea of barges and old, 1940s sort of British rule. I think that's equally in it. So Octopussy's extremely, apart from maybe the digital timepiece and a few scenes, where is it? And the digital display on the detonator, it could almost be set in 1941. It's got that. I think it's a quality to it.
Also, with John Glenn, still behind the camera directing, do you think he'd sort of become more confident as a director by that point, or do you think the later stages he seemed to have more control? Do you think there's still an influence of I think the producers sort of pushing him to do something which is a little bit more like, because if you look at Octopussy in terms of like its scale and stuff, it's a bigger movie compared to For Your Eyes Only. And do you think that sort of competition with Never Say Never Again, it had to sort of outdo it on every level?
No, I don't think Octopussy in any shape or form is a reaction towards Never Say Never Again at all. And we'll come to that slightly. We'll treat Never Say Never Again separately because I think it bears its own scrutiny. But I think John Glenn once again showed Bond brought down to earth. Again, the story of Octopussy has its roots in Fleming. Octopussy in the book the short story is a Major Dexter Smythe who's killed Hans Oberhauser, Bond's father-like figure in Kitzbühel, and many years later he's living off the ill-gotten gains and Bond tracks him down. Bond literally appears in the last 2 pages. It's a much more of a morality tale. And then the short story, The Property of a Lady, involves the Russians trying to pay off one of their agents by bidding up the price on an objet d'art, The Property of a Lady, a Fabergé. In the book, it's not an egg, it's a sort of kind of globe-like thing, and all that is co-opted. Those elements that are co-opted, but slightly reversed, rather like they did in For Eyes Only in the movie. But I think John Glenn once again shows that in this time there's no ski sequences, but he's got great aerial sequences by Corky Thornoff, who flies the Acrostar jet through the hangar doors, and also B.J. Worth and his stunt team, the stuntmen from Moonraker. The pre-titles are now on the Beechcraft sequence at the end. In fact, just a slight plug here, the French James Bond fan club have just written a 100-page glossy, 64-page large format glossy brochure on Octopussy. Brilliant journalism. And Matthew Field and my co-writer have done pieces on Corky Thornoff, B.J. Worth, and the original screenplay, which was done by George MacDonald Fraser of the Flashman books, who had a real sort of state to the R's, as Mark was talking about, and it in fact created a completely sort of the same sort of story but different. So in that story, Octopussy comes from October Debussy, which is her full name, which is she was born in October and was a fan of Debussy. But all of that backstory is kind of lost in the final script. Also, Octopussy herself was meant to be the first female villain. In an early treatment, Blofeld it starts the movie and steals money, and then that robbery is stolen from Blofeld by Octopus in a female gang. So again, this is zeitgeist, and you have a lot of gymnast and Olympic team members. Olympics was a big thing, the female villain. Where it's all slightly fat is, of course, and there's a great book, A Star is Born, where they chart Barbara Broccoli's early involvement in the castings of them, where they tried to cast, an Asian actress as Octopussy, but they end up getting, Maud Adams again. And of course, Kamal Khan an Afghan prince, is played by Frenchman Louis Jourdan, which you couldn't get away with now, but I guess it was a sign of the times, and still that sort of slightly unreformed casting process. But the film itself, looks great. Alan Hume is again back as director of photography. John Richardson takes over from special effects from Derek Meddings and does a seamless job, I think. Again, all real, all in camera, very few optic effects, if at all. And John Barry's back to do what is quite an interesting score. Again, John Barry at the time has been said that he's what Hair was to Samson on a Bond film. And I think his score is beautifully iconic. Rita Coolidge was the last time that, I believe she was a choice of Barbara Broccoli, who played her music, and Cubby Broccoli liked her. But it was the last time you'd probably have such a creative choice coming from the producers, because very soon it became an adjunct to marketing and reaching another demographic.
Was it Octopussy where John Barry sort of refined his gun barrel kind of theme? Was it A View to a Kill? Because I know A View to a Kill and Living Daylights both had a sort of similar kind of rendition of.
He always re-recorded them. I think he did do that. John Barry's back after his problem with the tax man. He was back living in London, and then the song was produced by Phil Ramone as well. And Tim Rice wrote the lyrics. And it's one of these songs that it's a bit like the film itself. At the time, it doesn't make a dent on the charts, but now it has its kind of zeitgeist pulp.
Yeah, when Jarvis Cocker is covering it quite beautifully.
And it's in Ted, the movie. Mark Wahlberg sings it in the movie Ted. But it has those Cold War tensions again. But again, it's a renegade Russian general with a renegade Afghan prince. He's not reflecting the Soviet point of view, which is reflected nicely in a great war room scene. Great Peter Lamont set.
Yeah, that feels like the classic kind of Bond stuff, we saw with Connery, that kind of that location, and that's where we saw these kind of great kind of throughout Octopussy, these kind of jumping from different location to location, which kind of all kind of varied and kind of detailed. I think it's always one bit that always kind of, not outside of the production design, was always one moment which I don't know if you guys would keep in or would you'd remove. Is just sort of it's all falling back on the sort of unnecessary humour with the sort of thrown in the Tarzan sort of sound effect as he tries to escape. And I just thought, for 83, you think that'd be a little bit like they wouldn't be doing it at that point. I don't know.
Ewoks did it in 83. There's a Tarzan.
There is
Return of the Jedi. Same year, the same cinematographer. It's not far to defend these things.
This is all Alan Hume's mistake he's made.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think maybe I don't mind the Tarzan scream because it's a nod to cinema. It's a nod to culture, and Bond sometimes does that, whether it's a little dig at the Beatles or another.
Well, it's also like the other moment where the great stunt from what was it? The Man with the Golden Gun, where the car flips and they had the sound effect. It's like people
never had a problem with the penny whistle either. That whole sequence, there's another little bit of DNA that they're reaching for Octopussy, and that's Raiders of the Lost Ark, because that was obviously a mammoth box office hit. It was one of the first action films, a new era action films of the 80s, shared a lot of personnel. Robert Watts, producer on that, worked on Never Say Never Again and You Live Twice, and he's, there's a lot of shared DNA on that one.
Yeah, no, I think Octopussy has those fun elements, Oliver. And now post No Time to Die, Bond has got very serious. It's very Sturm und Drang. Sometimes those silly bits kind of what makes Octopussy. Yeah, maybe they could have done without the Barbara Woodhouse sits and all these things and a few silly jokes like that. But that's why I say there is a tight Cold War thriller in Octopussy, surrounded by this kind of slightly flabby velvet glove of stuff. But they at the time
that's a good analogy. I like that.
At the time, Octopussy was a great romp and hugely, fun. In fact, my cousin, I was telling Mark, played the Maharaja in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
He just drops that in.
And I remember Raj saying, and I remember him telling me in 1982, he's been to the set of Octopussy where they've recreated an Indian bazaar in Pinewood Studios. There's that fun sequence with the fire eaters and, the firewalkers and the flame eaters and all that with the Indian tucked up. There, it's kind of location fun. Again, this is something that John Glenn does in that movie with West Berlin. You've got Remy Julien, great car chase with Alfa Romeo. And John Glenn goes to a real location. We're really in India, and he's interacting with the location, things that they don't really do anymore. It's something recognizably. You see the Lake Palace Hotel in Udaipur, a place I've been to, which is absolutely stunningly beautiful and captures, again, locations that aren't necessarily well famous. Bond films are still those things that made you want to go there and made you want to be there. And Octopussy captures all of that. Again, yes, Raiders of the Lost Ark was a huge impact, I think, on the action genre. But Octopussy, a lot of these sequences are written for the Spy Love Me, these India sequences. So it really wasn't that. But yeah, there was competition coming up to Bond. But I think Octopussy was still very much its own thing. John Glenn had a swagger and a kind of confidence about this because it's still very much its own James Bond genre, a little bit silly, a little bit burlesque, but you have that Hitchcockian ending at the end with the clown, and then you've got this somewhat of a ridiculous end battle with all the girls. But again, that's subjugating the formula. It's their way of saying it's not the tall boiler suit thing. Whether it works artistically, I think is a bit silly myself. But there's an idea of giving you the unexpected, like Four Heroes Only did, and that it should be seen in light of that instead of a big set with a boiler suit. Two bands when you've got gymnastic girls and Indian thugs on the gymnastic battle. So that's the kind of thinking behind it, whether we like it or not.
A lot of those Octopussy girls are great ambassadors for the whole Bond franchise 40 plus years later. Carol Ashby being one of the great sort of Bond girl ambassadors who carries that flame forward.
Mark, how did you meet Carol Ashby?
She doesn't mind me telling her this story. I nearly fell into her chest, having had I had one Vespa too many, and it turns out an olive isn't dinner. So yeah, a launch for something. I even have a photo that's not very good. She doesn't remember, thank God, but I did apologise. We're friends now.
We were at the launch of Terry O'Neill's book in Mayfair. Mark got a little bit tipsy, and I witnessed him falling into Carol Ashby's cleavage. I was green.
Well, if I was going to go,
it was green-eyed with envy. Thanks.
Yeah.
If you're going to suffocate, it's the way to go, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah, I literally fell into Octopussy Circus. So yes.
Were the fans kind of like in celebration of this movie, and were they expecting or sort of theorizing where the series would go next, or was there sort of a mentality or sort of notion that this was probably the last of Roger Moore as 007?
He had his last film for most of his reign. Ajay will probably remember the contracts. I think he was was it Octopussy or For Eyes Only onwards where he sort of negotiated and it
was each one, wasn't it? Paid after Moonraker, wasn't it? It was
exactly.
paid by.
So there was always this suggestion that this was his last, and maybe in an odd way that gives it's got a better bite to it. Because we're like, we don't know if we're going to get him again. Let's throw everything we can at this.
Well, I think this is the context where Never Say Never Again comes up, because everyone assumed this was Roger Moore's last film. The fandom at the time, I was a kid in 1983, they all saw that this film was going to come out, but Never Say Never Again was going to show Eon how to make a Bond film. And when Never Say Never Again comes out, it does very well. It has the highest autumn opening weekend in history. Sean Connery is an iconic return. I mean, think about it now. Could you ever have two Iron Man films made by different companies, two Spider-Man films in the same year? So we forget how unique and silly it was, although, as I said, it was the second time it happened since 1967. But Roger Connery coming back was the king across the water. But when his film came out, Never Say Never Again has great ideas, and depending on who you are, I find the American critics preferred Never Say Never Again to Octopussy. I think Octopussy is a better film for lots of complicated reasons, but Never Say Never Again obviously has to be a legally remake of Thunderball, but it's very much led by American writers and American directors, Lorenzo Semple Jr. and Irving Kershner, who did Empire Strikes Back. The sensibility is quite American, even though it's trying to be brought back by the uncredited writers Ian Le Frenay and Dick Clement. And Sean Connery himself is playing, I think, his Bond is influenced by Roger Moore's. It's more slapstick, more humorous, more kind of technologically adept, rather like the kind of things he was complaining about. They sort of throw sop to, and that showed how far Bond had come under Roger Moore's reign. So even though people thought, well, Sean Connery is the authentic original Bond, the way Bond was being played in 83 was very much in the Roger Moore Eon mold. It had changed the nature of Bond from 73 onwards. Roger Moore's Bond had become defining, as we see the effect on Never Say Never Again, which has many, many good qualities. Great performances by chief villain Klaus Maria Brandauer and Bond girl Fatima Blush in Ian Fleming creation, played by Barbara Carrera, and Kim Basinger as Domino. It's a great film. First time we got optical effects, post-production, Apogee doing that sort of stuff. That was the American influence on things. But Bond is played, his Britishness is played as a caricature in that movie, as he was seen. You've got the Black Felix Knight of Bernie Casey, so advances in that respect. But in other ways, it feels to me the action is a bit limp, because they had to shoot it differently with Never Say Never Again, because they had a £5 million star, Sean Connery. They didn't replace him with stuntmen all the time. They kept him front and centre, but the action had to be a beat below par, so to speak. But yeah, I think Never Say Never Again, it did less well than Octopussy at the worldwide box office. People didn't really know the difference between the two at the time. It sort of was released with great fanfare and did very well around the world. But I think in retrospect, I think it's seen not as an unofficial Bond film, but a kind of stepchild, a kind of film that is an anomaly. With the exception of Sean Connery, it could have been a great action movie in its own right. I don't think it blew away the Roger Moore Bond series as they claimed. And in fact, Never Say Never Again is released in the UK in December 1983. And the producers choose December 1983 to announce that Roger Moore will return one more time as James Bond in From a View to a Kill.
Well, there you go. So that's a great segue. I mean, it's with A View to a Kill. I know, Mark, you're a big fan of this movie. Obviously, Roger Moore said he's going to do it one more time. I think he had a bit of plastic surgery to make himself a little bit younger, which I think he kind of regretted later on.
He had a mole removed. Okay, that was the memo.
A couple of skin tags. There you go. For Bond fans, I mean, when I've spoken to them, or just general kind of fans of cinema, action cinema, they always felt that A View to a Kill was kind of the sort of the Darden of this sort of the Roger Moore kind of series, and they always sort of deploy the idea or the suggestion that he was just too old to be playing 007 and getting involved in all these kind of elaborate action sequences. In terms of the discussion we'd mentioned earlier, sort of reflecting the times, it's kind of the plot does make, I think, good strides to sort of reflect on what was going on with the microchip boom. It obviously doesn't go too far with it. I think it sort of chickens out a little bit. For all its faults, I mean, I think it's got at the heart of it a really good villain who. Christopher Walken, who I think the Soul Kinds were looking at for Superman 3, but he wanted to play Ross Webster. But that would have made, I think, the movie far more sort of memorable, I think, in terms of the villains. But it does make kind of efforts to appeal to the younger fans with the case of Duran Duran doing the song, which is kind of one of the most popular Bond songs ever produced, I think.
Yeah, it's the only one that's hit #1 in the States, or certainly the first. Yeah, I mean, like I said, you start with Octopussy, and it's a kind of George MacDonald Fraser boy's own caper of fountain pens and hot air balloons and steam trains and alligators. It's kind of pinned particular era and veneer. Cut to View to a Kill, it kind of did what they could only do and just go a little contemporary. So you, like you say, you've got the Atari, it's an Atari era, it's a Pac-Man era. We've all got these white goods now, whereas before, computers would be something that Bond villains would have in their Bond lairs, or MI6 might have something, Now, suddenly, we've all got our Spectrums, ZXs, or whatever they were called. We've all got our Ataris and our Donkey Kong Juniors and all that. So suddenly they're
Commodore and Spectrums,
Yeah, and all of that, and a real white goods awareness. And then you mix it with this Aaron Spelling Dynasty world, to the point that Aaron Spelling's Last Charlie's Angel is cast as the Bond girl, because the first one, Priscilla Presley, who they really want, is highly contracted to the Dynasty's rival, Dallas. So there's a sort of Aaron Spelling, I would say it's Aaron Spelling in Jodhpurs, with all of that. You know, the whole Chantilly Chateau Zorin's afternoon drinks party is pure Blake Carrington. It's pure sort of Colby's and Carrington's, and I love it for that. I absolutely love it for that. And to get to your original point, people laugh about Roger Moore being old. Yeah. And again, a lot of those fans who were fortunate enough to be the first era of fans, those guys that were perhaps 7 or 17 or even 37 in the 60s, and they grew up with it, and you know, there was a specific template, a specific creative DNA genome of what Bond was. And then Roger Moore, you know, yes, his stunt doubles, there's a bit of an age disparity between his stunt doubles and all the Remy Julian Parises.
Questionable wigs we see, don't we?
But there's questionable stunt doubling up in the Matera scenes of No Time to Die. They're better at it, but you can see when they've done it or they've digitized it, it's still a thing. And to me, as a View to a Kill Roger 80s Bond defender, Your Honor, I've got no problem with it. It's the artifice of cinema. It's like blue screen or green screen car chases. It's part of the cracks of vinyl that I don't want removed. So I've got no problem with Roger's age at all in the film. And I was 9 years old. Maybe if I was 29, I'd be more critical at that time. But then when you're 29 and you're looking back at what you used to love as your youth, you will be critical of it. But I was 9. Roger Moore, and I think it's something we forget about the 80s Bond films. They were key players in certainly in the box office, but also just the billboard, the bus shelter, the merchandise. They were there. So Roger Moore standing back to back with Grace Jones in A View to a Kill in that brilliant image with the slightly elongated legs, that was as 80s current and as 80s vital and as 80s iconic as, you know, Marty McFly looking at his watch or Axel Foley sprawled across the bonnet of his car. And I remember being a big A View to a Kill apologist 10 years ago, and kind of was the only one sticking my head above the sort of Siberian trench and getting shot off by a red helicopter. There's a massive love and dedication to A View to a Kill now. It's got, you know, to the point. It was the first Bond film that Kerry Fukunaga watched. You know, we are now in the era where 80s VHS kids are directing Bond films. You know, Sam Mendes was a 70s Bond kid. Kerry Fukunaga is an 80s one. So that's why it's slightly A View to Kill has some resonance and importance. And as AJ said, it was one of the last, if not the last, possibly, and you could go through and say I'm wrong, but the last Bond film that really uses its locations as its locations. Paris, the Eiffel Tower is Paris, the Eiffel Tower, the Golden Gate Bridge, Market in San Francisco. We're not going to a sort of thinly veiled Isthmus City or Prague doubling up for Montenegro. We're not doing that.
That is
yet.
true, yeah.
Okay, Matera plays Matera. It's not Rome playing Rome. Spectre did it as well, so you could argue that. But you know, there's a little, and I think that's partly because View to Kill still came out in that era of sort of Judith Chalmers' Wish You Were Here glamour, where that Roger Moore Concord Campari world, it was beginning to sort of dissipate a bit by the time of View to Kill, and certainly by Living Daylights.
I mean, I'd like to hold up my hand and say I was one of those people who saw it in San Francisco in 1985 and at the Odeon Leicester Square in 1985 and was underwhelmed by View to Kill. I thought Roger was too old. I thought... Mute him now. But recently I saw it with my friend and his 6-year-old son at the cinema in Olympia in Barnes in 2019, a glorious print. And the film was amazing. And I'll tell you why. They don't make Bond films like they used to. As Mark hinted, they have real locations. They go to them. They interact with them. Going back to John Glenn, the continuity, John Glenn is in his stride. He's got innovative action. We've never seen snowboarding before in the Arctic, in Siberia, shot in Iceland. You've got huge, interesting parachute stunts. Again, BJ Worth. So Willie Bogner's doing the stunts in Switzerland, in Iceland, who's done For Your Eyes Only and Majesties. John Glenn brings back BJ Worth to do the parachute stunts on the Eiffel Tower. And you've got a great car chase through the streets of Paris by Remy Julian, again, this is John Glenn's technical team. All of these things you don't see in new Bond films. You don't see action never seen before, devised especially for the screen, shot in camera. And these are the strengths of A View to a Kill. Its locations, its action, and also the plot is interesting. We talk about the zeitgeist. Apart from the casting, you've got this great sort of, initially A View to a Kill was going to have Halley's Comet being redirected to destroy the San Andreas Fault. The plot point, which of course was famously used in Superman to create Lex Luthor's new domain. In this film, A View to a Kill shows Michael G. Wilson's sort of technical background, where he wants to have that San Andreas Fault work, but through a legitimate, realistic means that end up having it flood. And again, this is the subcontext of that. There's a character called Howe in the film, which is based on a deregulatory San Franciscan politician that was sort of oblivious to the environment. So A View to a Kill has a slight environmental edge to it, causing ecological disaster. You've got these great villains, Max Zorin, who is a product of a Nazi backstory experimentation. You've got Mayday, this wonderful iconic villainess, an upcoming character who was apparently, Grace Jones was up for Octopussy, and all of these things are giving the film a contemporary edge. And the microcosm, the global monopoly on microchips is sort of a rewrite of Goldfinger that sort of predates the privatization of the military-industrial complex, which is partly what the original screenplays were about. The pre-title sequence originally of A View to a Kill was what became the end sequence of License to Kill, where Bond in the pre-title sequence surfs to Siberia and basically destroys 4 articulated lorries that were carrying ICBMs. And that was an idea of John Glenn's. So you've got lots of great action ideas. A View to a Kill is filled with them that we see later on. And this is how the Bond films, again, nothing is really, Bond isn't really reacting towards other films. It's very much its own genre. It's very much a formulaic quality that they enjoy reversing. And notice in A View to a Kill, once again, for the third time, there are no gadgets, there are no vehicles. It's quite Bond doing things on his own. When Cub 1, the Rolls Royce, which Mark will tell you about, is sunk, it's Bond using the tyre to get air. It's quite resourceful. Then you've got Peter Lamont's wonderful main-strike mindset at the newly reestablished 007 stage, which kind of gives you that old-school glamour and size that the Bond films were. So they're still very much Bond films, are very much in charge of their destiny. They're not really buckled or reacting to anything around them. They're just trying to keep up with times of story matter. But, they're still, A View to a Kill is still quite a personal movie for Cubby Broccoli.
Well, yeah, obviously Cub 1's appearing for a second time in a Bond film. It cropped up in a Shrublands car park in 65's Thunderball. But Cubby was also massively into his horses. He had, I think it was Brocco, one of his racehorses towards the end of his life. And my grandfather, yes, he worked on all the Bond films and drove Cub 1. He drove Patrick Macnee's car, and there's a family suspicion the hat that he wears in the film is also the same hat my grandfather wore, and the same hat that Daniel Craig wears when he's at the Shanghai airport posing as a chauffeur. Possibly. I need to get to the root of that. So, yes, it was a very big Broccoli film. It also featured California, which was nice and sort of semi-local for the Broccolis and their Beverly Hills world. Also, their political interests. Reagan had a history with Cubby, but also with California. He was the governor there for a little bit. So, it's got a lot of that. And also, there's one other thing. And before we move on to Living Daylights, it's often held up that The Living Daylights is the Bond film that had to react to HIV/AIDS and the first pandemic that we had in living memory. Only difference was that one got ignored. That's not entirely true. It's actually A View to a Kill. Kind of, there's bits of A View to a Kill that were facilitated because of HIV/AIDS and that horrible first wave of deaths. San Francisco was the epicenter of AIDS for all the horrible reasons, and it had a bad beginning to the 80s, economically, spiritually, creatively, culturally. Diane Feinstein, who was I think she was the senator she was mayor. She was Di-Fi, she's called now. She incidentally later on swore in Barack Obama when he I think on his second wave of presidency. But she was a big Bond fan, and I think like Roger Moore, and they were able to pull some favors. I wonder personally if some of the budget it suited to go on a sort of more familiar local turf as San Francisco. And one of the things I just find slightly bizarre, but I love its detail as well, is you have Mr. Howe being killed in his City Hall office. Well, one of the things they wanted to do was to try and change the mood of San Francisco. Let's have a bit of Bond in, and also Duran Duran. Don't underestimate the power of Duran Duran and that opening and the premiere and the fever for Simon Le Bon and co. when they had the world premiere there that was held at the Palace of Fine Arts. That incidentally, Naboo is based on in the Star Wars prequels. That's another discussion there. But they had this sequence of Howe being shot in his office at City Hall. But that is what had happened to Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone in 78, November 78, when they were both gunned down by one of their colleagues, which is all depicted in Gus Van Sant's beautiful film Milk. So when anyone says, oh, the Living Daylights, the next one we might move on to, was a reflection of HIV/AIDS, it wasn't. I mean, I don't think it. Yes, Bond is not jumping into bed with everyone in 1987, but he is jumping in with onto the yacht of a stranger at the beginning of the film and clearly killing 2 hours before he has to get back to the office.
I mean, to go back to slight critique of reviews, Roger Moore was 57. They display this Bond as the most sexually promiscuous in his film, from Commander Stacey Sutton, Kimberly Jones in the Iceberg Submarine, Stacey Sutton, Mayday, and of course Paula Ivanova, played wonderfully by Fiona Fullerton. And I think Roger Moore was presented as a kind of still man about town Lothario, so it sort of was aging a bit. But now if you think, this is when we go back to things like Harrison Ford playing Indiana Jones in 2008, Roger Moore seems really effective in this film, and he looks really good for his age. At the time, Harrison Ford was asked, would he play Indiana Jones again after Temple of Doom? And he said, his answer was, my name's not Roger Moore. Well, cut to 2008 and Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, I wish his name had been Roger Moore.
Cut to 2028, so whenever this
exactly
Indiana Jones 5 comes out.
It's easy to dismiss the ageism of looking back on Roger Moore, who at the time was dismissed. Now it seems quite okay. That's another thing about looking back at him. But yes, there was a silliness about it, but quite frankly, and again, going back to how far Bond had gone, the original short story from Review's Girl, which appears in the collection 4 Hours Only, is about Bond motorcycle dispatch riders having secret papers stolen from them by Soviet agents, and Bond unraveling that. Cut to this story, they updated it massively, but also with the computer programming and computer chips, and of course Duran Duran and the music, they brought it really up to date in the Grace Jones casting. So that's how Bond kept with the times. It wasn't really about Bond itself, it was about the world around him, which is a trope that they've used before. So that's why in 1985, when I saw it in California, it was a slightly diminished box office, but again, it still did huge figures and ensured that Bond was still, the highest number in adventure cinema was still 007, according to its marketing.
Do you think, obviously, with its diminished returns, do you think down to the fact that because the story just wasn't quite gelling with critics and moviegoers, or it's down to sort of competition at that time, as as you sort of alluded to earlier about not really being an action star at the time or on the big screen? We'd had, was it Superman in 78, but I don't think anyone really sort of saw Superman or even Christopher Reeve as an action star. He was just playing a superhero, and you didn't really associate that. You don't really lump Superman into an action film. It's kind of a fantasy adventure thing. But obviously we had Conan in 82 and First Blood with Rambo
Fletch. Was Fletch not an action movie?
But I think Bond still was. There were lots more popular entertainment things, but not really direct action hero rivals. I think Bond was a victim of his own success. Again, compared to now, this was the third film. At once every 2 years, they were produced and made like clockwork. They did great figures around the world, but I think people became a bit expectant of them. They were still formulaic. They hadn't quite started to experiment, which comes later. And I think there was a certain degree of just, like anything. Remember, Bond had outlived any other action hero by this point. So it was they were the Rolling Stones of Bond films.
Oh, yeah, sure. Do you think Cubby Broccoli was trying to avoid risk and sort of just we'll just get Roger for one more, and then we'll think about trying to recast later on, because it's always going to be. I think I've always had that feeling that the Bond producers hate the idea of having to recast soon. It's this kind of inevitable bit where you've got to do, which is like the biggest hurdle, I think, for the franchise. Always is this kind of crossing over to get someone else to be Bond.
No, I think that's completely not borne out by the fact Cubby Broccoli was very eager to recast Roger Moore from the minute he became expensive, and it was only the studio that intervened. They would have had James Brolin. Cubby Broccoli would have had James Brolin, but before it was only the studio that intervenes and actually says this is an insurance. Of course, as we've described, by Sean Connery helping him. But no, I think the way they thought about Bond was quite formulaic in those days, because nothing had been like it. I think they would risk every time they made a Bond movie, and I just think they weren't trying to break a formula which wasn't broken. It still was working. So, but yes, they weren't. We're in a different. When we look back now in 2022, it looks obvious to say. But every time they set out to make the biggest, most interesting Bond movie they could, and they hoped it would work, they weren't resting on their laurels. They weren't bringing back old stars. There was no legacy. There was still everything was innovative and new within the movie. They weren't trying to rely on old tropes of Bond by this stage. They were trying to bring something new to it.
And let's not overlook what Roger Moore and his era of Bond did. You could say this about any era of Bond, and you definitely can probably say it about Craig. But I think the reason we have Bond films today is because of Roger Moore.
Absolutely.
That's a random thing, because you should say, well, the reason is surely Sean Connery. Well, no, I think Roger Moore steered the franchise through its most potentially turbulent but most varied box office eras. When Daniel Craig comes in 2006 and leaves in 2021, and we've had, I mean, he comes in 2006, and Marvel are kind of the box office rivals or siblings for that whole reign. But if you go to Roger Moore, he starts in 73, where big cinema, and actually big franchise cinema and studio cinema, is on the wane. It's independent stuff. We're in the era of Easy Rider and The Godfather and Last Picture Show and The French Connection. They all seem like big hits, but they were the new wave. They were the indie boys, as was George Lucas. American Graffiti comes out the same time as Live and Let Die. So Roger Moore starts there, and then he steers it through the 70s, late 70s. The behemoth that was Star Wars is, I mean, the Broccoli's are quite wise to this even now. They don't mind competition at cinema, because all competition is business. It is, as long as people are going into that room, that building that's called a cinema, and they might spend their money on a Bond or a Star Wars, that's more important than them not going in and seeing either. So Bond steers it through Star Wars, and then steers it round Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then Gremlins, Ghostbusters, Beverly Hills Cop. Passage to India, no, maybe not, but he steers it to then leaves it in a place like Bond's at now. It's like, okay, so I think it's always precarious when a Bond actor leaves the role, and I can see echoes of 85 and where we are right now of, where do we go forward? What's going to be the new era? But hopefully, touch wood, we'll let culture, zeitgeist, and a bit of happenstance take us forward.
Oliver, there's a great example of 1985 in a film. There was a film called Remo, Unarmed and Dangerous, starring Fred Williams as this new kung fu martial arts spy. It was written by Bond writer Christopher Wood, directed by Guy Hamilton, and it was it was the first of many new Bond franchises that were overtly going to kick Bond's ass. It disappeared. None of us remember about it. And the thing about Roger Moore, as Mark said, what he did was hugely forgotten, that to take over, Sean Connery established it, and he's an icon. But no one ever, I think to this date, had taken over an iconic franchise of character and made it their own. So there is not a second Indiana Jones, there isn't a second effective Superman in real terms, because Christopher Reeve dominated it, whereas Roger Moore took over and changed the nature of what Bond could be. And for that alone, and rode, as Mark said, a whole bunch of cinematic, from the downturn in cinema attendances to the resurgence of popular cinema exemplified by Superman, Star Trek, Star Wars. But Roger Moore rode all that. They were no longer world beaters in terms of, what was fashionable and cutting edge. but they were still world beaters in audience entertainment and maintaining a franchise. And as Mark have said, incubating and curating new talent behind the scenes and on-screen action. That's what the Bond films did, but wasn't really heralded because we took it for granted because they were made so seamlessly. So that's what A View to a Kill. It's interesting to compare the last Roger Moore Bond film with the last Daniel Craig Bond with No Time to Die, how they made an end of an era artistically and emotionally for Daniel Craig. Imagine doing that for A View to a Kill. No one could have conceived of it because they weren't making Bond films like that in those days.
Now we've got to sort of, pass on the torch to Timothy Dalton as 007. Obviously, Living Daylights, a refresh of the supporting cast. But I think Living Daylights to many is, well, for me personally, is one of my favourite 007 films. I think, Ajay, you're a big fan of the Living Daylights. For me, sort of experienced this as a kid. It was on the, going back to Superman again, the Superman 4 sort of rental tape had the trailer for the Living Daylights on it, and had those great Warner Brothers kind of trailer reels they always had. I think, was it Michael? What's the guy? The radio guy did the voiceover for these trailers.
Thank you, Paul Gambaccini.
Paul Gambaccini, that's it. Yeah. I loved his voice for these trailers. It was great. But seeing the Living Daylights trailer really kind of sold me on this kind of new hard-edge Bond. And Dalton was obviously going back to the roots of Ian Fleming's books. He wasn't going to play it like Roger Moore at all. Also, he was being respectful and being his own James Bond. I mean, it was still a slight crossover of View to a Kill in terms of it wasn't that much reinventing the wheel with 007. It was like, okay, we've got a new guy in the role. Continue the trend of taking a popular musicians to do the song with Aha, and John Barry sort of reflecting the times of what was going on in film music by incorporating synthesizers into the score, which is, again, is one of my favourite 007 scores, along with A Few Eyes Only. I think in terms of the people behind the scenes as well, will continue on from A View to a Kill. Also, John Richardson doing the visual effects, which are probably some of the best miniatures I think I've seen in the Bond films, with the great forced perspective bridge sequence, which is just you think it's real. It's just actually like a miniature, So I think it's still out of this sort of changeover period of Roger to Dalton. It still kind of felt in the same vein of the Roger Moore kind of A View to a Kill, but I think it still had something there to appeal. I think one thing to appeal to younger audiences this time instead of the sort of the older crowd. It felt a little bit more, okay, we're going to spice things up a bit and try and appeal to sort of the younger fan base. Or maybe I'm completely wrong in that comparison, but
I don't think it's ever framed like that. I don't think they sit around and go, how do we appeal to the younger families? I think it just evolved. I think what happened was when Roger Moore left, I mean, Roger's then wife, Louisa Mattioli, said a very interesting thing. She said, you'll only appreciate how good Roger Moore is when you try to replace him. And I think that's very true. Timothy Dalton came into casting. He'd been on their radar since 1968, 1980. As you know, Pierce Brosnan had been originally cast, but couldn't do it because of precluded from his Remington Steele contract, and Dalton comes in and vows to take it back to the spirit and essence of Ian Fleming's books. The character that he plays smokes and looks like the character from the books, and is much more of an attempt to go back to a physically active actor, a person who shows his feelings, sweats. It's not charming and effortless like Roger Moore. From his costumes, having that leather jacket and having slightly more casual stuff, it's attempt reclaim it to just a man of his time, rather than Roger Moore was slightly a man out of his time towards the end. And I think that's all they did. They took that, they had a plot that was based on this sort of shenanigans with Oliver North and Iran-Contra gate. Here, they've flipped it around. It's a Russian Oliver North and Brad Whitaker. And they take that contemporary political headline. They do take a sort of look at the romantic era of Bond and give him a single relationship with Cara Millavey, played wonderfully by Marion Darbo. But there is probably a subtext of Bond shouldn't be bedding around like he is in the midst of the AIDS epidemic. But they don't overtly say that. It's not. It's just taken on board. But Timothy Dalton anchors it back to the kind of characteristics he's drinking. You're going back to Felix Leiter. It's a terseness with M. In the original short story set in West Berlin, originally called Triggerfinger, Ian Bond has to shoot the assassin and kill her. And when he realized the assassin is in fact local concert cellist who is a trained assassin. He decides not to kill her and just maim her instead. And psychologically, the title means she's lost her psychological will to kill somebody, and Bond gets reprimanded. In the film, that base note is lost, but they keep the essential idea and then have this political nebulous story, which I think probably doesn't work out of the context of the time, especially now.
Yeah, in terms of the plot-wise, I think that's probably the most sort of, I don't know, slightly confusing, or the film sort of loses its kind of focus on that, I think. It sort of become a little bit too long with its runtime.
Yeah. You say that, I saw Living Daylights as part of Prince Charles Cinema in London's. They had a summer season of Bond, and they've just got a new one starting for winter 2022. And you often go back and go, please hold up, because the Bond films are beasts of cinema. I've been wagging on about that for the last 2-3 years, doing exactly what the Broccoli's did, and hold on and support cinema rather than streaming. And it's when you actually, they play and breathe differently on the big screen. And I was there Saturday in July last year watching The Living Daylights, and you're like, please don't drag, please be all right. And you know what? Yes, we're Bond fans. Yes, we're John Glenn 80s Bond fans as well. But I thought it did not drag. And often a lot of Bond films drop the pace ball a bit in the last act. And this didn't. It breathed really well. I was very surprised. And all of that, the big action sequence where the Hercules takes sort of 4 hours to take off, and Mariam Darbo's sort of running around, and her doubles are running around. It kind of didn't drag. It worked well. And there was when I did, it was last year, I did a piece for Yahoo about the 40th anniversary of John Glenn's For Your Eyes Only. And one of the things that John Moreno, who plays Luigi in the film, the film's Sacrificial Lamb, he highlighted very quickly when I interviewed him how John Glenn would remember that he was an editor. So he knew what he had to get in the can. There was a simplicity and an ease and a quiet, scene is done, let's move on. And I think that the action sequences, particularly in the 80s Bond films, don't become, or don't have what sometimes the Brosnan action sequences have, where they become almost second unit trade shows. They lose themselves in the mix. And I do think actually that the Craig films, and definitely No Time to Die, really clawed that John Glenn action ballet and choreography back, where the story is moving with the action, not the other way around.
That's what I like about Living Daylights, is that exactly. The action is a lot more sort of dynamic
and story led. It's all story led. It's I still find it a little jarring. AJ's right. It's sort of about a year after the Living Daylights, where the Mujahideen kind of morphed, and the history and politics there is very complicated. But the Taliban, ISIS, all the names I was never expecting to mention on a podcast about 80s cinema, that's kind of sits. And I always think, if it wasn't for the beautiful photography of that, it's only a Bond film can make the Taliban look like out of Africa. So that's me being very flippant there. And I like it for that. I like Art Malik doing his sort of old hangover days from Oxford. I love the artifice of that. Yes, half the extras are all the extras in the Never Say Never Again scenes, where they're kind of playing similar roles, where Kim Basinger gets horribly stripped at the end of that film. You're right, Living Daylights is totally, it's actually doing what Octopussy does. It goes back to Fleming and the short story, but it also goes back to that slightly, it is a now world. We are set now, all Bond films are, but we are sort of in,
a boy's own yesteryear.
It's a boy's own world of all the Afghan fashions, it's not. Yes, okay. Yeah. Dalton wears a sort of, he goes anoraks rather than tuxedos, but that was because the suited hero needed.
Rambo 3 would do the same, you know what I mean? And ultimately it was dated like when it came out, because obviously the war had finished. I think Peter MacDonald had said to me, this war was finished, when they were making it, and this is going to be a problem, isn't it? So it's just kind of, again, reflection of what was going on at the time, but
a rare reflection, Bond doesn't always do that. We've never seen an IRA villain. There's nothing worse than having the real villains, there's nothing worse than something happening a week before the film comes out, and then that's going to be a little delicate and controversial. It nearly happens with No Time to Die in its sense of virus, but they frame it in a nanotech world, so it's not COVID, and besides, it was made before COVID.
But one of the things about Living Daylights, to talk about the John Glenn direction again, it's the through line. You get this wonderful stunt sequence in Gibraltar, which is again real and unsurpassed. It's very exciting. You see a very physical Bond running for the first time since the Roger Moore era in Parachute, just dressing younger, being more active, sweating, and you get that wonderful sense of danger, again mixed with the glamour of him landing on the yacht and Linda's yacht, and but Timothy Dalton's humour. Remember, we had 14 years of quippery, and Timothy Dalton's humour, it is there, but it's probably not effective. I think it's better in other films, but it's more comic relief than comedy, and you smile with relief. He says, there's all sorts of lines that kind of
horse's arse. He says, like it's more dry. It's more dry humor with him.
There's a human level when Saunders, played by Thomas Wheatley, gets killed in Vienna. It's a very shocking moment, and the love story between Bond and Cara Milovy, I think, is effective and moving. And it's the first time we've ever tried to do that. Bond is presented in a much more complex way, and it rewards repeat viewings. All the story points aside, John Glenn does a great job of handling that. But again, I think the script and the screenplay is still very much a Bond film. And when you go back safety, it's still, they weren't breaking the formula. They tried to tweak it later on, but this still was very much as an action adventure movie with these wonderful set pieces. Again, going back to the set pieces, B.J. Worth, the fight at the end, I saw that at the Odeon Leicester Square the day after it was premiered, and 3,000 people took their breath as that cargo net falls out. It's still an action set piece that I was there with Mark at the Prince Charles. It still is hugely effective. If you've seen the trailer for Uncharted, the new video game movie with Mark Wahlberg and Tom Holland, right? The end of that trailer is the Living Daylights, cargo nets falling out.
Yeah, it is. But that's done in CG, and this is Living Daylights is for real, so...
This is something, sorry to cut in there, AJ, but this whole idea that the 80s Bond decade is dismissive. And I love that we've got enough people standing up and saying, oh, hang on, that's not strictly true. If you look at the last two Mission Impossible films, their stunt teams, their directors, the whole sense of action choreography, clearly loved and watched 80s Bond films, because there's a lot. I mean, there's more than just 80s Bond films in the last one or two Mission Impossibles. But when everyone says, oh, Mission Impossible is now superseded Bond, and the Broccoli's need to up their game, I'm like, well, at the moment, the Mission Impossible, the Ethan Hunt game, is blatantly ripping off Bond. So you've got a Hercules type plane and a rope netting scene. You've got Tom Cruise doing the Rick Sylvester For Eyes Only mountain work. It's like, so how dismissive and terrible were these films? Because the physicality of those 80s Bond films is still influencing all action cinema today. And I don't say that in a hyperbole way.
I think the 80s Bond films were consistent and well made and came out regularly, and people sort of didn't really appreciate the art in them. They didn't appreciate the attempts. Admittedly, now in the rearview mirror, No Time to Die, they weren't risky enough. But at the time, they were trying to move the Bond needle forward. Certainly, Living Daylights, John Glenn is trying to. The tone is completely different from what the 14 years before. It's a sign of the success of Roger Moore, but also Dalton is trying to reclaim it and trying to get it back to some humanity, some semblance. He talked about being influenced by Harrison Ford.
No, we have his Bond, making emotional choices.
Yes.
He's getting involved more than just like, this is the mission, we've got to go do it. And I think that was, as we all know as Bond fans, it sort of lays the groundwork for Daniel Craig to sort of take it, return to sort of Bond in a more very serious fashion, where at the time Dalton, so underrated because he was just sort of, the critics were like, oh, it's missing the fun element of the Roger Moore films. He's playing it too seriously, it's too dry. And just like, the Living Daylights did really well, didn't it, at the box office?
Well, it was a huge step change. It did $191 million worldwide against A View to Kill's 151. It was a new Bond. But could it have done better? All these sorts of things, you can only look at hindsight. But at the time, it was seen as an artistic rejuvenation. You mentioned the John Barry score with the use of synthesizers. John Barry had pioneered synthesizers for his score for The Lion in Winter in '68 in medieval music. He put synthesized, but yeah, it had fresh boot in the arm. It felt fresh. The Aston Martin Valance, the V8, was kind of heritage Bond. And again, notice that's back in No Time to Die. They're now referencing the Dalton era and the 80s era. But to me, that's the hidden legacy. I think Dalton was probably ahead of his time, as you say. And also the films weren't as well written. They couldn't create his humor. They tried to. It just was, they were still stuck in a little bit of a rut. But I think the Dalton era, I'm a huge fan of him as James Bond. I think he's my favorite James Bond. But I can also see that Daniel Craig and Pierce Brosnan took that seriousness that Broughton allowed to be brought back in and have an authenticity to the character that had been somewhat missing towards the end. But again, that's not to knock Roger Moore, because what Roger Moore did was exactly needed at the time. But Dalton's, I wouldn't even call him a man of the 80s. Basically, this was the first influence of a slightly human action hero, not as comic book and action heroes Roger Moore.
Yeah, he's Daniel Craig in a Roger Moore Bond film.
Yeah,
ish.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Dalton was very important to the Broccoli's. When Cubby died in the summer of '96, the only Bond that was one of the pallbearers helping the family at the LA funeral was Timothy Dalton, and he's very close to this day with Barbara Broccoli. I've often,
and Michael Wilson.
I've seen often if I'm at an event and Barbara's there, I forget, the man you're with is Timothy Dalton. I always just sort of go, hey Barbara, hi Tim. So they're very close together to this day, and I think they loved what he did. Again, he didn't kill it enough. He should have had more films, but fate and time didn't allow it. But he also had the dignity. I mean, his run as Bond officially in the role lasted up until, AJ, correct me by all means, but I think it kind of went up to Easter '94 because he was a good placeholder for various
the Bond of record
studio discussions. And
he was also just still being deployed, in the early '90s on video game covers like James Bond: A Duel for the Mega Drive, and he's still kind of being used. And to me as a kid, it was just like, oh, this is still James Bond. Is there a film now called The Duel? As a kid, like, oh, have I missed something here? So yeah, he was still kind of deployed as the sort of the marketing for Bond.
On June 29th of June 1987, which was when the film Royal premiered in the Odeon Leicester Square, I was there in the square, and I saw the hoopla about it. They renamed Leicester Square James Bond Square, and the Aston Martin front. I saw John Glenn, Cubby Broccoli, Michael Wilson, and the crowds there were enormous. Diana and Prince Charles on these charity balloons, and the Aha was the big hit artist that they're all screaming Aha.
Simon Crane jumped off the top of the Odeon facade. Yeah, I remember that.
Guys, what do you think of the Aha song? I mean, I know John Barry had sort of had conflicts with the band because they preferred their sort of more synthy version than the one, I think, with the orchestral kind of mixed in, which is kind of actually a better kind of a version of the track.
Don't mind it. It definitely, so I was about 10, 11 when the film came out. And I remember all the girls on the school bus talking about that song, and it's a bit like when Billie Eilish. Well, who's Billie Eilish? It doesn't matter. The job's done. She's the musical billboard along the highway of commerce, and Aha were that year's commerce. It could have. I mean, they kind of went in a different direction for License to Kill. I don't know who's the big star of '89, but Bananarama. But they went with Gladys Knight.
MC Hammer.
I don't mind his vocals.
Morton of Aha is like one of the best male singers around. So he's
like a Norwedic Bowie. I always think if Bowie did a Bond song, it would sound like Living Daylight.
That is a good idea. I mean, why? I'm surprised I never asked Bowie to do.
He hated Bond films. I mean, he was allegedly on a short list to play Max Zorin in A View to a Kill, but his line, the line was, "I really don't want to be spending 5 months watching my stunt double hang off a cliff." I mean, yes, that would have been amazing. Bowie and Grace Jones, the sort of the two doyens of Andy Warhol Studio 54, up against Roger Moore. I'd have gone.
Max Zorin was written for David Bowie, but David Bowie, I think his music, if you listen to it, was certainly influenced by John Barry. And I think Paul Vaxar, who wrote the song with John Barry, wrote a very evocative, anthemic Bond song. It's kind of remembered now. Aha is still a great group. They still play live. They love the version out, and they've actually relented. I think they prefer the John Barry version out, which is what they play live. So it still lasted. They've lasted. And the song is wonderfully, like A View to Go, part of its time. And that's the beauty of it.
Well, as we lead on to License to Kill, the final James Bond film of the 1980s, and to be honest, probably one of my favourites. It's up there, probably my top 3 License to Kill is because of. I like the notion of that Bond is it's not. I love the idea he goes rogue. He gets involved with the enemy, which is kind of not something that Bond does. He sort of colludes and pretends to be someone else, and there's emotional stake there. He doesn't, even though he's got 2 women to sort of I suppose get with, but he makes the right choice at the end. But it is the one that is obviously rated a 15 in the UK for its violence. But yeah, to me, it seemed the most contemporary, even though it was kind of criticised for being a little bit behind because it's dealing with the drug trade, cocaine, and Scarface had done it, and Miami Vice TV series, which was kind of really popular, had already explored that avenue of the sort of the bad guys and the drug trade. It wasn't the Soviets anymore. Bringing on Michael Kamen to do the score, kind of who was now sort of the action score guy to go to, even though I don't think he enjoyed action movies, but he seemed to be the guy to do it, to like Die Hard and also Robin Hood a couple of years later, and Highlander I think he was kind of known for. I think this film kind of brings to the end of that sort of period, but also John Glenn I think at his finest, I think, as a director, because he is a time where we're seeing something a little bit different and seeing a really stronger emotional angle to the movie, which I kind of really enjoyed. And it still delivers on the action. Really spectacular stuff, especially the whole chase sequence at the end with probably one of the biggest explosions in the Bond film, with the gas container.
I remember seeing License to Kill. I think I remember exactly when it was. It was June the 4th, 1989, the same day as Tiananmen Square. Weird how these things aligned. Oddly, China was one of the first mooted locations and backdrops to the film, but John Glenn and a few of them went out and did some reconnaissance and felt we could get into trouble here with permits and local politics, and they were trying to cash in a bit on The Last Emperor, a film which Maurice Binder did the titles for, but it wasn't to happen. It wasn't to be.
But wasn't there budget issues with License to Kill, hence why they kind of left Pinewood? Obviously, because Batman was going on, but I don't know if that was an issue.
To set up License to Kill, it was originally licensed revoked. Bond was going to go to China at the best of the Chinese government. There was a very detailed plot blueprint worked out that finds its way in other movies. But because of budgetary and infrastructure considerations, they couldn't do it there. Then you had all sorts of problems. Pinewood Studios went 4 walls in 87. The fact that our friend Tim Partridge reminded me of this morning. He says that
that's him now.
Basically, the Bond films. When you went to a studio in England, you got all the technicians with it, the electricians, the plasterers. In 1987, Pinewood stopped employing them. They said, you've got to bring your own crew on board. Plus,
so it's freelance, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Superman had that problem as well. Plus, the tax regime in Britain changed. Foreign earners couldn't earn money without being taxed. So they ended up having to force themselves to find another place to shoot in. Also, what predominated all the 80s Bond films, that we said, was that they kept their budget, licensing a budget between $36 and $40 million. Four Eyes only started with 8 years. It hadn't gone up 4 times. Inflation adjusted, the movie budgets had probably gone down. So John Glenn had to be very resourceful in making the money hit the screen, but also make an exciting adventure. So you see that in the casting, you see that in the crew. You don't get fancy names in front or behind the crew. They have a consistent writing team. There was a writer's strike that prevented Richard Maybaum from physically writing it. I think he conceived of it, and then Michael Wilson had to write it. So they had to keep a very tight ship, and partly they set up a new studio in Churubusco in Mexico, and they made a little go a long way. And they reused ideas again. Once again, we can see John Glenn's action team of Remy Julian with the stunt coordinator with the articulated tankers at the end. We can see Corky Fornoff flying the jet, doing the aerial stunt with the water skiing stunt. And you've got parachute stunts in the beginning with BJ Worth, again, dangling Sanchez's plane from the helicopter sequence, a version of which we later see in The Dark Knight Rises. Christopher Nolan and Steal from the Best. So once again, you've got this plot that attempts to slowly take on the formula of Bond. So Bond is placed in a much more nuanced, disparate character, thrown out on his own, out for revenge. You get the plot point from Yojimbo, the Kurosawa movie, where Bond intercedes a villain's organization and tries to destroy it from within. Yojimbo became the plot for A Fistful of Dollars. And yes, it is involved in Bond enveloping himself in the organization, but that's a trope from the Fleming books where Bond would often do that. And unlike the action cinema,
but it's surprising they didn't do that more often. You know what I mean? It's a great kind of plot point, thing to throw in.
But it veers away from the formula, because by this time in the late 80s, as you said, you had the Joel Silver action movies, Lethal Weapon, Die Hard. All of these movies were beginning to have an effect, and I think they don't really influence License Kill too much, apart from the casting, some of the choices. Michael Kamen, of course, came in to replace John Barry, who had a health problem with his throat. Otherwise, he would have done the movie. So they look rather like Bill Conti. They get the up-and-coming guy and Michael Kamen. But apart from those flavourings, the film actually is very much... It's the only Bond film that turns on Bond being British, because he's a British agent. And also, unlike the drug trade in American action movies at the time, Bond actually goes to the fictional Isthmus City and, like, as you said, explores the drug trade from within, how they co-opt the politics, President Lopez, how they co-opt the finances. Truman Lodge is a Gordon Gekko-esque character. You get Professor Joe Butcher that takes on the TV evangelist things at the time. The zeitgeist elements of License Kill are much more than just the drug trade. It's the Central American politics, the Contras, the right-wing anti-communist American-backed terrorists are.
Could you say it's kind of a more of a sort of the English kind of view of what was going on in America?
Yes,
you know, when we saw things like with RoboCop, with Paul Verhoeven,
exactly.
Dutch seeing American, capitalism just going crazy.
That's a perfect example. A European, even though it's written by a European take on that scene and internationalizing it. So that's what License to Kill is at its core, and it's got this great anti-scene. And John Glenn, again, making a little go along. Alec Mills had replaced Alan Hume as the director of photography and did a great job. You get these wonderful wide vistas of Key West and those island roads. You get the fantastic sort of Mexican locations doubling for, the Lymphatic Institute at the end, doubling for Isthmus City. You get some local casting. Pedro Almorendes Jr., who, of course, was the son of the actor that played Cohen Bay in From Russia with Love. And you get all sorts of interesting, pithy bits of casting. Professor Joe, played by Wayne Newton, a famous nightclub entertainer. And then you get the kind of Fran Sanchez, played wonderfully by Robert Darby, one of the best written actors. And
probably one of the darkest sort of villains we've come across, isn't it? Because I think Ozzy gave it its rating was him sort of abusing his wife. Near sort of the opening act. Really.
And again, ironically, it draws a lot from Unused Fleming. That use of the whip and the wave crest is from the short story, The Hildebrand Rarity, with its villain Milton Crest. You get whole chunks of the novel Live and Let Die, where Felix Leiter is maimed to the sharks. That's from the novel, which they couldn't shoot in the movie. And all these elements, Bond's antipathy being thrown out by MI6 was a kind of way to reinvent and give Dalton an edge. It was written for this film. That, you can see the point where Dalton's Bond goes fishing. Dalton in real life was a big fisherman. And all these action stunts. Again, Dalton is physically placed in the centre, recognisably, in a way he learned to water ski, in a way that Roger Moore's Bond couldn't really co-opt with Roger Moore. Here they tried to make Bond much more physical, and it works in that way.
It gets the underbelly of American politics and American culture just slightly. Even the whole influence of Ernest Hemingway as the backdrop. The Farewell to Arms was all shot at Hemingway's house, and he wasn't always, he got the darkness of characters and the solitude of characters, all framed and hemmed by this sense of America, but the Americas as well, which I think the film it gets all of that as well. And it's at the time I was 14, it was totally contemporary License to Kill. It does sometimes look. It looks a bit studio now, but then again, it's like artifice. I don't care if it looks dated or a little bit dated now. And on the big screen a year ago, a few years back when I saw License to Kill, it did not look dated. It had a great fresh, those Key West scenes. I've been to Key West, and Key West hasn't changed, so it feels very now in a way that Living Daylights was perhaps, as I say, pinned to that Fleming mahogany veneer world. This was more of I always quip about it, but I mean it's sort of the Peter Lamont Venetian blinds and filing cabinets. There's a bit more sort of contemporariness, whilst Bond is echoing something that he doesn't always do. It's there in Diamonds Are Forever. It's there in Live and Let Die. Bond being a fish out of a fish in an English fish in American water, which I think I wanted Craig to have a bit of that, but that we didn't get there.
Well, do you think there's like, obviously they throw in I think there's a kind of the weird sequence where they have a couple of ninjas turn up to to face off against James Bond with his kind of new gadget he's got from Q, which is kind of, it's great. Obviously, another great thing about this movie is that Q gets a larger role, which is great to see. But the sort of seeing ninjas turn up felt like a sort of something out of a canon movie.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
But it's interesting to see how they deal with the Bond formula elements, like Moneypenny, played by Caroline Bliss, who sort of was okay in Living Daylights, barely gets anything. Robert Brown is there.
I think the Dalton films is the one, well, the pair of films out of the whole franchise where they don't know what to do with Moneypenny. It's odd.
Well, the female characters in general, I think, are badly written. They're not consistent. Pam Bouvier played wonderfully, but it is sort of not given consistency. At the end, she ends up crying, and I think later the Bond films would write women better. But they're trying to give an edge, and Lupe Lamora again is the villain's mole, quite a Fleming-esque character. I also think that you talked about the ninjas. The other interesting zeitgeisting thing about this film, you've got East and West. There was a big fear as Japanese companies were buying up corporations in America that America's cultural identity would be lost. So you've got East and West.
That's kind of explored in Ridley Scott's like Black Rain.
Yeah.
There's sort of the invasion of the East.
It's implicit in Die Hard. It's implicit in a lot of those movies where those kind of characters. That's an implicit subtext to what those films are really about. And in License to, you've got the West being represented by Central and Latin America, and the East being represented by China. Those are the new leaders of the drug cartel. That's who's going to dominate the world, rather than the Eastern, the European-centric view. And that's what License to Kill brought, that freshness to it. But again, you've got this story that's quite straight line, Bond out on his own and out for revenge, seeking revenge on Fran Sanchez and destroying his drug smuggling oil cartel, which obviously is something that kind of still resonates because it's still part of the world, but it was novel idea then. You see lots of movies but as I said, also you've got televangelism, you've got Contragate, you've got the financial crisis, all thrown in the mix of this movie. Dalton's and the costumes reflect, again, out of context from the years of Roger Moore's suaveness. Roger Moore played a contemporary character. He wasn't stuck in suits. He was dressed appropriately for Key West. And so Dalton was very much contemporary of his time and reflected the fashion and the dictates. It was going away, trying to shed its fusty, dowdy image of Bond. And I think in context, that's how it should be looked at, including like the glamour of the female costumes and all that, the pastels that Sanchez wore. The costume designer was the designer from Miami Vice, Jodie Tillen, replaced Emma Porteous. And you had, they were trying to give a visual look. Even the cinematography was trying to be moodier, darker, trying to create a much more pithy palette rather than that very clear, bright.
As you comment on the darker edge of it all, I mean, as soon as the film starts, Cayman score sets the tone immediately with probably one of my favorite gun barrel kind of musical renditions. It just like I would love one day they sort of, even with the new Bond, to start with that kind of gun barrel music. That would be like, oh, you're right, you're in for a kind of a serious ride from that point.
And you were going to have, of course, Michael Kamen team with Eric Clapton for the theme tune. Again, it was License Revoked, which is the hidden theme song that not many people have heard. And then of course they end up going with Gladys Knight and the new,
which is a great song, incredible song. I thought, it's really big. It feels very Bondy.
And Patti LaBelle as well. We always forget that one, which then Celine Dion made a standard for herself, and no one believed that it was ever Patti LaBelle had ever done it, and done by Diane Warren, who's like this amazing Oscar-nominated. She's one of the most Oscar-nominated lyricists.
In a way, the score gives it a classicism, but the film's very contemporary, but the score is very much big band Bond, and it lasts. I think that song's well loved and well revered amongst Bond fans. Again, of course, it was written by Walter Afanasieff and Jeffrey Cohen and Narada Michael Walden, who then had to give credit to, I think, John Barry, Anthony Newley, and Leslie Bricusse, because it's so oversampled Goldfinger, if you like. But yeah, I think the score by Michael Kamen is very energetic, very spiky, goes really well with the film. And again, the action is unique. The tanker chase at the end, as you said, Oliver, is unique. But it really, again, John Glenn loves it as a film. I think because it's hampered by budget, and that comes to the point why it didn't quite, it was geared to be a massive hit at the American box office. It underperformed there radically, but it still was a worldwide hit. But I think the paroxysms of a sort of inconsistent marketing campaign, not matching the spends of other studios, a kind of slightly muddled sense of the movie.
It also it was a 89 was a busy year for the cinema. It was overstuffed, a kind of a release schedule with so many other big movies, mostly sequels again. Like mirroring 83.
Yeah, but it was still up there. There was that great show Cinema Attractions. A few listeners might remember it. It was a top 10 of what was on in America at the time. But that was an era where we were anything up to 6 months away from seeing these films.
Yeah,
and I always
exactly.
used to get up and watch this. It used to be on at 2 a.m. on sort of ITV regional telly. And it was never on the same time each week. And they would play trailers, full trailers for stuff. And I remember that the American trailer of License to Kill sitting brilliantly alongside Lethal Weapon 2 and Ghostbusters 2 and Young Einstein. I'm not, but it was kind of it was up there. I mean, 89 was a very bit like 82. There was a massive amount of franchise cinema came out, and yes, Bond maybe got a bit pinballed to the side from that, but globally the film, as AJ probably got better figures on, the film didn't do that bad, and also it didn't kill Bonds. There was because after License to Kill we have that 6-year gap. There'll never be a 6-year gap between Bond films ever again after that. And but to a degree, the momentum that Dalton did, I always think, well, it didn't kill Bond, License to Kill. It might not have made the big money, but it kept enough momentum. Dalton was in the role for another 5 years.
Just to address that point technically, I mean, firstly, Dalton's film License to Kill did underperform in America, made about $36 million, hugely underperforming. But around the world, it grossed about 156 million against that budget. It was a success. Again, look at the rivals, things like Lethal Weapon and Die Hard. They do much better in North America, but around the world, they don't do anything as well as the Bond films. So around the world, Bond films bring in a lot of money. And Dalton's film was seen as a misstep, but they announced 2 new Dalton films. Dalton was never going to not be Bond. In fact, the 1991 script, which is by Osborne and Davis, would have been the perfect third Dalton film. It would have been his Skyfall. It would have been his Goldeneye. In fact, large elements of that screenplay find themselves in the latter periods, and the humor would have been good. I think Dalton, it's just an unfortunate thing that the reason for the delay, of course, the studio was again bought up by an Italian conglomerate, the Canal Plus and Credit Lyonnais, and Giancarlo Peretti basically used the Bond assets to fund the purchase of the studio. So Broccoli and Eon and Danjak were in litigation with the new owners of the studio that precluded a new Bond film being even written until 1993, apart from those abortive Bond's 17 screenplays. But I think that was the reason why. And then it becomes a situation. Timothy Dalton's non-Bond career hadn't really flourished. He was terrific in The Rocketeer. And I think there was a view that maybe his time was done. He's gone to have a solid career outside, but Pierce Brosnan's time was come. Remember, Pierce Brosnan was merely reclaiming the throne. Apparently, he didn't need to screen test for Goldeneye. He just did the screen test that John Glenn did for him in 1986.
Well, Goldeneye would have been still, I think many fans often say, like, it would have been a great fit for Dalton.
It was written for Dalton. Yeah, the Michael France script. And I think Pierce Brosnan. But the thing about Dalton is his legacy is in Daniel Craig, and I think License to Kill was unfortunately, got caught on the hop as a bigger fan. I think also writing wise, I think they needed to find a new voice, a new vision, which I think they did with aplomb in Goldeneye. And they just need to freshen up the team and doing a lot with very little. So Goldeneye has a much more increased budget to these films. And I think that's the thing that gets lost in the mix. From 1981 to 1989, you had a Bond film every 2 years. There'd been world-beating successes. They'd been diminishing in box office terms, but still are memorable, and we still see echoes of them before. even at that time, throughout the 1980s, you had John Gardner Bond novels, which contemporized Bond, which went to Raymond Benson Bond novels. Bond was still very much seen as a contemporary character. They weren't leaning into the legacy. They weren't trying to echo and have Easter eggs. They were very much trying to come up with something fresh and original each time.
Out of all the Bond films of the 1980s, which one? Well, let's go with sort of personal favourites of that decade. For me, I mean, there's loads of elements in the Living Daylights which I love, but I think License to Kill is kind of, it's sort of, as at my age, you know, seeing that and the action, it seemed the most sort of contemporary, and it's the one I sort of would go back to sort of more often than the others. Where the others the Roger Moore ones always felt like great Sunday afternoon kind of films to watch, where License to Kill is like a Saturday night movie. So that sort of, that fits into that kind of like that, you know, having a takeaway and watching a Bond film. But also with the sort of rise of VHS in the 80s, you know, for many of us sort of discovering the Bond films and maybe missing out on seeing things like License to Kill, Living Daylights, we can now see, we saw those at a younger age and they're sort of more impressionable, where your dad was probably watching, you know, Sean Connery and perhaps Roger Moore. But to me, the Dalton period, that little couple of years with him was like, to me, that it felt like Bond, you know, and he wasn't too old. You know, well, he was smoking as well.
Oliver, if I might plug a book at the moment, Mark O'Connell's Memoirs of a Bond Fan, Catching Bullets, is a wonderful digest of growing up in that period and catching Bond films out of order and beautifully rendered by Mark's world of VHS and watching on TV. It's so evocative of that time. And also the prism through which we look at Bond. We look at Bond in out of order. And I think, so my favourite James Bond is Timothy Dalton. He's the man for me in Fleming books, in my view. And I think Living Daylights is a sentimental favourite, although I really like Octopussy as well. So they kind of straddle both things, but I'd probably say Living Daylights and Dalton. Living Daylights and Dalton was Casino Royale, and License to Kill and Dalton was Quantum of Solace. It was very much like that divide time. I think the 80s were too successful and we take them for granted. And I think, especially looking back now, real locations, real stunts, real action, and a kind of consistency is what we'd see. So if the Prince Charles Cinema is showing it in the cinema, and it's great to see Bond films at cinema. That's, as Mark said, that's where they're born to be seen. And you see a lot of the great fun of the cinematography, the size and scope of the John Glenn era reflected then, and the innovation of scenes you don't see anymore. So that's what I would say. The legacy of John Glenn is in the action you see now.
View to a Kill, of course, with a little Octopussy comes up the rear, as it were, as well on that. I love A View to a Kill. I like what it represents for me personally, but also what it represents. It was I think that's also a thing that we always come back to in any Bond discussion, Bond fandom discussion. We're lucky to be Bond fans. There's 25 films and counting, or 27 films and counting. There's a lot of decades to pick from. That's partly why it can get so feverish and sometimes a little hostile, because everyone's right. You're just right in a different decade. But View to a Kill for me was the film that I most anticipated when Mark Gatiss contributed to Catching Bullets a little bit. He summed it up brilliantly. He said, it's the first, you might watch a Bond film and then love Bond forevermore, but it's the next one after that you anticipate becomes your favorite.
Absolutely.
And that was my view. Octopussy I got taken to and didn't really know much about it. Loved it immediately. But View to a Kill was the first one I followed. The first one I sort of, my ears and neck perked up when Duran Duran, there was like a 10-second clip on Newsround or something. I'm Team Zorin through and through.
Would you say the 80s decade was perhaps the most exciting period for James Bond in terms of where it was going, or in terms of, like, you know, or in terms of, like, you know, who got involved, and in terms of the music and the advertising for these films, you know, and the filmmaking had obviously improved.
Yeah, you can't ignore the 60s. I mean, the 60s, the DNA, the genome, to use that word again, of what Ken Adam did, of what Normal One still did for the sound, what Peter Hunt did for the editing, what Maurice Binder did for the titles and the branding. I think you can't get around that. But despite the Aston Martins and the DB5s and the Louis Armstrongs in No Time to Die, there is so much in place that the 80s Bond era did. You know, even just the idea of Pinewood Studios, the home, the spiritual, physical home of Bond, that there was a period where Pinewood was really suffering, and, you know, I had friends that would walk around the sets whilst their dads were working on Octopussy and Superman 3, and it was a ghost town. It wasn't, but Bond was propping it up in the same way that Roger Moore Bond, perhaps more so in the 70s, but Roger Moore Bond was propping up the Odeon and propping up the high street
infrastructure
in a way that we kind of slightly overlook. So I think the 80s has a lot of administrative, creative importance to Bond that we overlook when we say, "Oh, Roger Moore was too old when he was in a shower with Tanya Roberts."
I mean, I think Oliver, it's easy to decade-ize Bond films, and I think for the reason we've said that, I think because the 80s was the most consistent in terms of production, in terms of success, it becomes slightly overlooked and underappreciated because we take it for granted. And when we've got bigger names and breaking the formula and bigger budgets and more experimentation, all of that groundwork could only be done because of the 80s stuff. And also looking back, people who thought Bond was too comedic or too funny in the 80s, too formulaic, might look back fondly and wistfully going, well, I kind of knew what I was getting. As Daniel Craig has broken the mold and been hugely credible, successful and artistically, sometimes you might yearn occasionally for that pantomime era Bond, that seasonal treat. And I think that's the majesty of Bond films, like Beatles albums or Superman iterations. You pick what you want. So you've got the choice of the 80s. And I think artistically we made a case how they captured the zeitgeist. They innovated in terms of action and direction and location, and how some of that isn't being done now. So when you go back to a film, when you watch it at the Prince Charles Cinema, or you read a John Garden novelization, you actually say, well, actually, that was a lot better than we thought. I'd say it's the most underrated decade artistically.
That's an interesting point. There you go. That's a wonderful sort of send-off to this podcast. Well, thanks for joining me, chaps. That was really informative.
Thank you, Oliver.
There's a lot of stuff there I didn't know about, so you've kind of just filled in some of those gaps there. Thank you very much.
No worries.
Bless you. Cheers.